Hi everyone! Several years ago I made a video series called Flat Out Wrong, addressing the lunacy that is the Flat Earth movement. Back then this pseudoscience was considered pretty fringe, even among other science deniers. Creationists laughed at Flat Earthers. Today it seems to have gained acceptance. More and more people are choosing to reject not just some science, but all science. Basically, acceptance of science is viewed as something that goes against their political views, or something like that. So Flat Earth has gained popularity a lot, and I figured it was time for me to return to the subject and update the series. This is FLERFPRATT, Flat Earth Points Refuted 1,000 times. The first point I want to address is, of course, that there is no evidence supporting the spherical Earth model. In other words, where's the curvature? Where's the curvature? Show me the curvature! You can't show me the curvature! Flat Earthers, or FLERFs, seem to be under the impression that the scientific consensus is something made up by some cabal of devil worshippers in black robes who simply decide what they want people to believe. Scientists then unquestioningly promote this dogma. This, of course, is only possible because FLERFs are willfully ignorant of how science works. In particular, the entire process is completely transparent. Because of this, those of us who actually care about learning don't just know what is known, we also know, or can find out, how it's known, and can, at least in principle, verify it for ourselves. Sometimes that's not that difficult, as we will see here. So how do we know that the Earth is round? Well, there are several ways, and this certainly won't be a complete list. For dramatic reasons, I should probably leave the most obvious one until last, but since Flat Earthers won't watch the entire video and are already posting copy-pasted weapons-grade stupid in the comments section, I figured I'd start with the most obvious one. And no, I don't count pictures of the Earth from space. I want to stick to ones that you can actually check for yourself, and most people don't have access to satellites. That leaves the most obvious evidence, the horizon. On a flat Earth you can see arbitrarily far, barring any intervening terrain, mist, or other obstruction, of course. For example, you can easily see across the Atlantic. Of course, in reality, the horizon gets in the way. This is the distance from you where the curvature of the Earth results in points on the surface being obscured. Looking at the horizon a distance d away from an altitude h, we get a right triangle with sides r, r plus h, and d. Using Pythagoras' theorem, this gives us d equals the square root of 2rh plus h squared. For small h compared to r, this is well approximated as the square root of 2rh. With r equals 6,370 kilometers, in other words 6,370,000 meters, and h equals 2 meters, we get d equals 5,048 meters, just a tad over 5 kilometers. Granted, in practice this distance can be increased by atmospheric refraction, but this relies on favorable weather conditions, and this only applies locally, so you can never see arbitrarily far, which you always can on a flat Earth. Not only does the horizon exist, it behaves exactly as expected, obscuring objects from the bottom up. This was beautifully explained by a drawing found in an astronomy textbook from the 13th century, which also shows that the apparently sunken objects can still be seen from higher altitude. This is why the castle can be seen from the crow's nest, but not from the deck of the ship. You'll notice that in the formula, if you increase h, the altitude from which you are observing the horizon, d will also increase. The existence of the horizon shows that the Earth curves away from you. And you can also show that using a method that flat earthers used themselves to try to prove that the Earth was flat in the documentary Behind the Curve, with hilarious results.
If you're seeing through this hole, through the next hole, and seeing the light at the backboard, or at 17 feet off the water, the Earth is flat. If he's holding it up at 23 feet high and we're seeing the light, well, that's because the Earth's curved. So I should only be able to see it when it's at 17 feet. Okay, go ahead and drive down there, Enrique. You're gonna hold the light there. Enrique, how high is your light?
17 feet.
I mean, you know, it's as, we don't see you, Enrique. Lift up your light way above your head. Interesting.
Yes. Interesting indeed. Not a single FLERF cared. Another version of this experiment uses 3 poles, A, B, and C, of equal height. A telescope is mounted on A and is aimed at the top of C. Since the Earth is curved, B will appear to be taller than C. These direct observations of the Earth's curvature should be enough to convince anyone that the Earth is curved. Of course, it wouldn't prove that the Earth is a sphere unless we make observations all over the planet, which is quite unreasonable for most people. But if enough FLERFs would bother to look at the horizon and notice that they can't see past it, and then share that information with other like-minded idiots, they would at least find that the Earth is curved wherever these observations are made, which is perfectly consistent with the Earth being spherical and completely inconsistent with it being flat. But wait, we have to do this. Why, if the Earth is curved, does the horizon look horizontal? I mean, hell, that's even why we call it horizontal. I mean, why is that? Shouldn't it look like this? It's simple. For one, because you only observe a small part of a very large sphere, we can safely say that each such observable patch is approximately, albeit, as we have seen, not perfectly, flat. But there's more to it. Because the Earth is a sphere, it has spherical symmetry, duh. That means if you look parallel with sea level in any direction, tangent to the sphere that is, the vertical distance between your eye level and the horizon will be the same in every direction, meaning the horizon must be horizontal. In order to see the horizon being anything but horizontal, you have to be looking down on Earth, radially in that is, rather than just tangentially. This is why the horizon becomes visible from high altitude, where you are clearly looking down at the horizon. That is, you see this curve, not this curve. Next, we have another observation that I guarantee that every flat earther has made. On occasion, the sun sets. Now, couple this with the fact that even FLERFs in other parts of the world won't agree when this happens. We have time zones, and it's clear that the Earth can't possibly be flat. It must be curved. Otherwise, the sun would be visible either to everyone at once or to no one, because it would be either above or below the Earth. FLERFs typically claim that the sun is moving in a circle above the disc-shaped Earth, illuminating the area beneath it. They say it appears to set because of perspective. It appears to get closer and closer to the horizon the farther away it goes. And yes, this would be true, but it would also become visibly smaller, and again, it would never set. So this excuse only makes the model easier to falsify. It would only reach the horizon at infinite distance, at which point it would also be infinitely small. And since it remains above the supposedly disc-shaped Earth at all times, that obviously won't happen, because the Earth is not of infinite size. In fact, assuming that the sun is at a height of 3,000 miles, or 5,000 kilometers as they usually claim, when the sun is above the Tropic of Capricorn, from the opposite edge of the supposed disk, it would be 8.7 degrees above the horizon at midnight. That's fine, you might think, as you would expect midnight sun in the Antarctic at this point. But the problem is that at the same time it would be 22 degrees above the horizon at the North Pole, where it shouldn't rise at all. 8.7 degrees is as low as the sun could possibly be according to the standard FLERF model, ever. This is obviously inconsistent with what we actually observe. This observation cannot be made on a flat Earth unless the sun is here, in which case it would appear to set as seen by everyone on the disk. The fact that the sun sets at different times at different longitudes shows that the Earth is round. Of course, the same is true for all other celestial objects as well. On a flat Earth, every star should be either visible to everyone or to no one at a given point in time. Instead, what we see is that different stars are visible from different locations. This is because the Earth itself blocks most of the sky from any given location. This is why, for example, it's impossible for me here in Sweden to see the Southern Cross, and it's similarly impossible for someone in South Africa to see the Big Dipper. This would not be the case on a flat Earth. Another related problem for flat earthers is the convergence of paths on both hemispheres. Where exactly is the Southern Cross? It's one constellation, which is due south of Chile, due south of South Africa, and due south of Australia, which, contrary to what some FLERFs claim, exists. Yes, there are FLERFs who claim that Australia doesn't exist, but I'll get back to that later. What this means is that due south is not radially out, as FLERFs typically believe, but rather the direction toward the South Pole, a single point. That proves that the surface of the Earth is what's called a geometrically closed surface, like the surface of a sphere. This doesn't just disprove the standard FLERF map with the North Pole at the center, but literally all flat Earth models, because the closed surface is, by definition, not flat. The fact that you can see different celestial objects depending on where you are is easy to verify. Just talk to people who live in other parts of the world. You can even talk to your fellow FLERF morons. A great way to see how the Earth is curved is to look at Polaris. Get your FLERF buddies who live directly north or south of you to help out. Measure the elevation of Polaris. You'll find that your observations completely contradict the Earth being flat. Polaris would have to be in multiple places at the same time. The extreme case is when one observer is at the North Pole and another is at the equator during equinox. In that case, the first observer will see Polaris directly above an elevation of 90 degrees. The second will see it precisely on the horizon, an elevation of 0 degrees. This is of course because the observers are tilting 90 degrees relative to each other, because the Earth is round. Let's keep looking at celestial objects. We all know what the moon looks like. Interestingly, we can disprove the FLERF snow globe model of the Earth by looking at the moon from different locations. Its face is always the same. On the standard flat Earth, these two observers would be looking at the moon from different sides, so it would not look the same to them. This means that if the Earth is flat, the moon is not moving in a circle above it, as FLERFs typically believe. But what's more interesting, and actually shows that the Earth is in fact round, is that the moon appears to tilt at different angles for different observers. This is most obvious during first and third quarter, when half the moon is dark. From here in Sweden, the terminator, the line between the light and dark side, appears practically vertical. But when I'm on vacation down by the Mediterranean, it's clearly not. This is because as I move south, I tilt more and more compared to what I'm used to. Here's what the moon looks like as seen from Sweden, Italy, Cameroon, and South Africa at the same time, and here's why. While on the subject of the moon, during a lunar eclipse, the sun, the Earth, and the moon form a straight line, so the Earth's shadow falls on the moon. This is why lunar eclipses only occur during full moon, and on a related note, it's also why solar eclipses only occur during new moon, when the moon is in front of the Earth instead. And before some FLERF says that this isn't how eclipses work, yes, it is. Not only do we know how to explain eclipses, we know how to use this understanding to predict them, something you can't do. Until you have a model with greater predictive power, I suggest you shut up. As the ancient Greeks who understood this noticed, the Earth's shadow on the moon is round, because the Earth is a sphere. I have one more thing to say about the sky, and then we'll get back down to Earth. If you look at how celestial objects move in the sky, you'll notice that on the northern hemisphere they move counterclockwise around Polaris, and on the southern hemisphere they move clockwise around a point near Sigma Octantis. This is obviously because the two hemispheres are upside down relative to each other, because the Earth is round. And yes, of course, this is actually because the Earth rotates, but that's a subject for another time. FLERFs love to change the subject and talk about how the Earth isn't spinning or how gravity doesn't exist, and we'll get to those things. But they have nothing to do with a discussion of the shape of the Earth. And that's what we're talking about here. Okay, getting back down to Earth. Any world map is a projection of a spherical surface onto a plane. When you project a spherical surface onto a plane, you distort it. That means you get an inconsistent scale. FLERFs tend to believe that the North Pole is at the center of the disc-shaped Earth and the South Pole is actually its circumference rather than a point. This means that they are projecting the surface in such a way that east-west distances are stretched out more and more the farther south you go, reaching infinite distortion at the South Pole. The projection algorithm used is called Azimuthal Equidistant projection. Flight times, however, which are easily checked, are consistent with the actual distances and not the projected ones. For example, on the FLERF's favorite map, the distance between Cape Town and Johannesburg is significantly greater than that between London and Stockholm. I'd say it's about twice as long. The former direct flight takes 2 hours, the latter takes 2:30. This is consistent with the real distances, 1,240 kilometers and 1,450 kilometers, respectively. Another obvious example is LA to New York compared to Perth to Sydney. The distances are roughly comparable, 3,800 kilometers and 3,200 kilometers, as are the flight times, about 5:30 and 4:10, even though the latter, which is actually shorter, looks to be far longer on the Azimuthal equidistant map. Now, of course, flat earthers will say that these flight times are bogus and, again, that Australia doesn't exist. This is one of the main reasons why they can't accept the existence of Australia. It simply stretches out so far in the east-west direction that it becomes a problem for their model, and they have to deny its existence because of that. Unfortunately for FLERFs, people who take these flights can compare the posted flight times against the actual flight times, meaning that they have to cry conspiracy. Again, unfortunately for them, this conspiracy has to be unreasonably huge because it has to include everyone who is in a position to book a flight, including the FLERFs themselves. This is also why it's impossible to sell flights to non-existent destinations. The second someone books a flight to such a destination, the jig is up. So everyone, including the FLERFs, must be in on a conspiracy and agree never to book such a flight or to keep quiet about its actual destination if they do. Now, I'm sure FLERFs can come up with excuses as to why they would be excluded, but at the very least, it would have to include everyone who has ever flown any significant distance. Closely related to this is the issue of flight paths. On a flat Earth, the shortest distance between any 2 points is always a straight line. On a spherical Earth, it's a great circle arc, which only looks like a straight line if viewed from directly above. If you actually look at the paths taken by airliners, you'll see that they fly in curved trajectories consistent with great circle arcs. Yes, this path is shorter and thus faster and more fuel efficient than this path, which only looks shorter on this flat projection of the Earth's spherical surface. On the FLERF's favorite map, this leads to ridiculous extremes on the southern hemisphere, in particular the flight from LA to Sydney. Yes, Australia exists. Should go northwest rather than southwest. Once again, we see what a problem Australia is for FLERFs. So to sum up, by looking at the horizon, by looking at the sky, or by navigating over large distances, or performing some pretty simple experiments, we can all verify that the Earth is a sphere. Or at the very least, not flat. What this means is, I think it's safe to say that there's no such thing as an honest flat earther. This is important. Flat earthers are not just misinformed and ignorant, that's only part of it. Most importantly, they are willfully stupid, and it's always been my clear impression that this whole thing has more to do with politics than with the shape of the Earth. They associate acceptance of science with submission to a perceived tyrannical authority, a secular, liberal, intellectual elite they refer to as NASA, which is actually just the American Space Administration. Now, this is typically, but not necessarily, the same authority Fox News calls the radical left, which also accepts evolution, anthropogenic climate change, the safety and efficacy of vaccines, and so on. In short, science. So it's a conspiracy theory. That's it. Let's get this straight. Science is completely apolitical. It only becomes political when politicians politicize it because they don't like what it has to say. What this means is that there's really no point trying to convince a FLERF that the Earth is round. They already know it is, and this has been confirmed by people who have left the cult. And yes, that's what it is, a cult. What they tend to say is that the Earth being flat was something they believed in their hearts and not in their brains. That means flat earthers don't actually believe the Earth is flat, they are simply devoted to the idea. And since their understanding of epistemology is on par with their understanding of science, they can't see the difference. This is why flat earthers will respond to criticism with hostility. They are not interested in whether they are right or wrong. They already know they're wrong. Criticism of the idea is an attack on something they are devoted to, something they love. Effectively, they love to be wrong. See ya.